Thank you, Mr. Carpenter, for being so nice.
Thank you, Mr. Carpenter, for educating me. Thank you, Mr. Carpenter, because you're a great teacher in everything you do.
Mrs. Getz.
Thank you, Miss Getz, for helping me read and getting ready for college. Thank you, Mrs. Getz, for helping us learn more words.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Carpenter and Mrs. Getz, for teaching me.
Thank you, Mr. Carpenter and Mrs. Getz, for educating me well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jaeger Pound, for helping me learn.
Thanks, Mrs. Thompson, for helping me in math.
Thanks, Mrs. Thompson, for making my day.
Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, for teaching me.
Thanks, Mrs. Simonson, for teaching us reading. Thank you, Mrs. Simonson, for teaching us vocabulary. We're lucky to have you, Mrs. Snyder.
Thank you, Mrs. Raw.
Thank you, Mrs. Bergeson.
You're so nice, Tracy. You're awesome.
Thank you, Mrs. Pittman, for helping me out with my O's.
Thank you, Mrs. Bergson and Mrs. Snyder.
Thanks, Mrs. Bergeson and Snyder.
Thank you, Mrs. Snyder, Mrs. Williamson.
Thank you, Mrs. Corder, for being the best music teacher ever. I'll do it. Awesome. Thank you for helping me with my homework, Miss Victor. Hi. Thank you, Mrs. Carlson, for being a great teacher.
Go.
Gracias, señor Gorman, para ayudándome. Lectura. Thank you, Mr. Goodman, for helping me reading. Thank you, Ms. Hardboard, for helping us with school. Hi. Thank you, Mrs. LaHare, for helping us in the IMC. Hi, Mrs. Weibel. Thank you for being my teacher the whole year.
Thank you, Mrs. Victor.
Thank you, Mrs. Victor. Thank you, Mr. Kashi, for teaching me math better.
Thank you, Mrs. Dietrich, for helping us expand our reading vocabulary.
Thank you, Mr. Herzog, for helping us learn science.
Thank you, Mr. Hovelson, for being an awesome band teacher.
Thank you, Miss Mayer, for helping us in gym.
Thank you, Mr. Quinn, for teaching us new things while having fun.
Thank you, Mrs. Redding, for being such a great facts teacher.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts, for teaching us music.
Thank you, Mrs. Walter. You have a great way of teaching and you're very kind.
Thank you, Mrs. Shannon, for being a great teacher.
Thank you, Mrs. Bjornson, for helping us with reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Strom, for helping us learn language arts.
Thank you, Mrs. Person, for helping us type faster.
Thanks, Mrs. Lang, for helping me whenever I really needed it.
Thank you, Mrs. Shannon, for helping me with all my work.
Thank you, Mr. Newman, for always being there to help me.
Thank you, Mrs. Peterson, for being there when I need help.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mrs. Addison.
Thank you, Mrs. Colbian.
Thank you, Mrs. Lang, for helping me do my homework. Second hour.
Thank you so much for teaching us.
Thanks, teachers.
Thank you, Mrs. Getz. Say why.
Thanks, Miss Burkham, for helping me when I got in trouble.
Oh, thanks, Mrs. Latch.
Thanks, Mrs. Colbian, for all the leadership tips.
Thank you, Mr. Kashi, for helping me with my math.
Thanks, Mr. Mares, for correcting me when I do wrong.
Thanks, Mr. Newman, for being an awesome math teacher.
She's awesome. Miss Dawson is awesome.
Thank you, Mrs. Martin.
Thank you to all the teachers, and I love coming to school.
Thank you, Mrs. Mann.
Thank you, Mr. Clinton, for being my history teacher.
Thank you, Mr. Hanson, for having me love science.
Thank you, Mrs. Harris, for all the science labs.
Thank you, Mr. White, for making me such a great math student.
Thank you, Mr. Houston, for teaching me about technology.
Thank you, Mrs. Audison, for teaching me the magic of the genitalia and drugs.
Thank you, Mr. Tuvman, for letting us play the games.
Thank you, Mrs. Hertzfeld, for all the help that you did.
Thanks, Mrs. Devery, for all the help.
Thanks, Mrs. Devery, for always helping us when we need help.
Thank you, Mr. Eberline.
Thank you, Mr. Eberline.
His face, Thank you, Mr. Eberline.
Thank you for helping us. Stop. Thank you for, thank you, pause. Thank you for helping us with our school, Miss Hardboard. Thank you, Miss Hardboard, for helping us with school. Hi.